I'd be happy then, but only then when they have studied every aspect, not just necessarily the legal aspects, but have studied the effect it could have calling for another referendum.
What do you think the public mood would be?
Well, I don't know, but I'm sure they'll take that into account and should. If it's going to cause any terrible problems for the country, they would take that into account. I mean, the men I'm talking about are very responsible people in this country.
Right, okay. Stephen Johnson has a similar question. Stephen Johnson, yes.
Do the panel think that the concerns of almost 50% of the electorate who voted no will be fairly represented by our politicians in the future?
Right, Emily O'Reilly, aren't we in an extraordinary situation now where half the electorate, and in fact almost 62 voters in 3 in rural areas, are now not represented on this issue by a Dáil party?
Absolutely. I was just saying to Declan Khyber before the programme began that in everything I've read since the result came in, I've yet to read anything that really cogently argues or cogently analyses what this means. I mean, it is extraordinary that the country, or those people who bother to vote at least, is split evenly down the middle, given that all the mainstream parties and most of the national media were in favour of a certain result. Now, I think that the newspapers, because most of them are private companies, and I think they have an absolute right to write whatever they like, take whatever editorial line they like, and yet I think a lot of people are concerned, and should be concerned, that the anti-side was not put forward with the same vigour, shall we say, or reflecting the thing. Well, I did, and I find it just extraordinary, the reaction that created.
What reaction?
I mean, well, I mean, I felt at some point like a bit of a zoo exhibit, you know. My colleagues, journalist colleagues, and other people were coming up to me and looking at me and saying, is it true you're actually thinking of voting no? It was extraordinary, whereas an awful lot of them were going around very openly talking about their yes views, and that was seen as okay. That was sort of an acceptable bias. My bias was seen as unacceptable, and I thought that it was a very powerful lesson in what it was like to be outside the loop. And I thought that was actually good for me as a journalist, because I suppose I've been part of this awful thing, the cosy liberal consensus, because on all the other issues on that particular menu, I would be inside the loop. And on this issue, I took a different view, and have always taken a different view. And I found it quite disturbing, and especially when today the newspapers were littered with the words compassionate, pluralist, and so on and so forth. And I found a very almost harsh attitude and very critical attitude taken to what I had written, which I wrote in good faith and having studied the issue at length and for a very long time, and I found that quite disturbing.
Declan Khyber, this brings me to a point you once made, that the liberal intelligentsia in Dublin 4 and so on are not necessarily that liberal at all. They're politically fashionable, they want their own view reflected.
It is true that sometimes they don't notice the limits to their own tolerance, and there were a number of occasions last week when the mask certainly slipped. And I'm saying that now as someone who supported yes and was a signatory of the Right to Remarry campaign. I think the question is almost a heartbreaking one in a way, because I do believe there are quite a lot of politicians in the country who were in sympathy with the no side, but who felt hobbled for one reason or another by the fact that the parties pretty well took a mainstream line on it. I think there are also a lot of yes politicians who are particularly reticent, because being honourable people, they didn't want to come on too strong in this rather complicated situation.
That their seats should think of as well.
Well, you can, that's a cynical reading, John.
No,
but I think
it's
the
a
other
real
reading,
reading.
yeah,
It's
but the other reading is possible as well. And I think what's interesting is that many of the parties would have had internal divisions. Even the Green Party was divided, as we know.
Even the Democrats. I mean,
yeah.
I found
they're always
one
divided on these
interesting
issues, but
yeah,
they give a free
there were
vote.
two
Yeah.
prominent members of the PDs who one would normally fit into the sort of the classic Liberal profile. I'm not talking about people over in the west of Ireland either, and who said to me privately that they were in favour of a no stance, but because of their particular position within the party, they couldn't say that. So, I mean, there was, on both sides of the fence.
But what I think should have happened was this, that all the parties should have allowed individuals to take a vigorous, conscientious line on it.
Yeah.
If that had happened, I think there would have been quite a lot of politicians vociferous on both the yes and the no side.
I agree.
And the political discourse would then have been much more representative of the real range of feeling in the country. I
You
think
know, no whips, in other words, on the whole issue from the start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And I
that's
think
not the way our politics has ever worked.
No, and Gareth Fitzgerald said last night on television that this didn't happen because of his belief that Fianna Fáil would always impose a whip line. Now, if that's the case, the ultimate losers in this, paradoxically, are Fianna Fáil. Because today Bertie Ahern faces a situation where many of his followers will be saying, hey, you've got well out of touch with a good deal of your followers. And I think if Fianna Fáil had managed some kind of exemplary pluralism within its party, in its approach to this, it would not now be so cut up and sore after the referendum.
Yeah. Des Hannafin, you once said when you were battling, you said Fianna Fáil was at the crossroads. You said this 5 or 6 years ago. Fianna Fáil is at the crossroads. Nobody is representing rural Ireland, the old values, particularly on this agenda. And Fianna Fáil ought to look after its interests in that regard and go that way.
Yeah.
They haven't, have they?
No, and I could tell you what has prevented them, and it's prevented Fine Gael too. When you're in a coalition situation, and when you have a minority party that represents, or minority parties represent about 18% of the electorate.
He's talking about you, Michael.
Control, well, I mean,
did you
agree
get
with this, control the government, you know. Then you're in a situation where the big party has to do what the small parties are telling them. That we had it with the PDs, we had it with Labour, you now have it with Labour. And I sympathise with Fine Gael in this respect. I believe that the majority of the Fine Gael people did not want divorce, majority of TDs. Now maybe they'll be contradicting me tomorrow, but I believe myself they didn't want
But surely they were tested during Gareth Fitzgerald's crusade, and only about 5 or 6 of them went against the party.
Went against them, but they didn't do anything during the...
Well, the 5 or 6
during the
did. They lost
campaign.
the whip. Some of them lost their seats.
Yeah,
over
they did.
it, but
They did. But that was during the abortion one, actually.
no, that was the
it?
divorce one.
Yeah.
Alice Glenn was one of those who left and lost her seat in the next election over the issue.
She did indeed lose her seat. A courageous lady, Alice. I criticised her once, and I apologise now, Alice, if you're listening. I shouldn't have, because I criticised her for something she never said. It was in her name in the paper, and I had to come back immediately, you know.
Right.
No point in going into what it was, but anyway, Alice, sorry.
This is the new Ireland.
No, go on, Des.
But you see, you take this just the Fine Gael party. Now, take John Bruton, for instance. He proved his integrity again this time. He proved it during the Maastricht Treaty, and I'll explain why. During the Maastricht Treaty, himself and Des O'Malley were on television, and Des O'Malley said, we lose all the money that's coming from Europe if we don't vote for Maastricht. And John Bruton said, no, stop that now. He said, stop that. He said, he says, be honest about this. We do not lose the money if we don't go into Maastricht. And I remember saying at the time, you're an honest man. I wonder how far you'll get. Well, now, he's got to the top. And last Sunday, which I think was the turning point for them, in fact, last Sunday he said on television when he was addressing the nation from on RTE, he said, yes, unfortunately, he said, the first family, he said, in a divorce case will suffer. And he says, unfortunately, you can be divorced against your will. Now, he admitted that on the radio. I didn't hear any of the ministers following him from there on. They just ignored that he had said it. But he did say it, which showed the man's integrity again. And I think he deserves someone to mention that, and that's why I mentioned it.
But on Fianna Fáil and its future, and this 50% now who may feel not represented, do you think Fianna Fáil has lost its way?
I think all the parties have lost their way, you know, and in Fianna Fáil, which is close to me, and I can't help that. I mean, my tradition is a long one with the Fianna Fáil party in good times and in bad times. And I was very upset last year when I lost the hip. The hip, I'll be losing that shortly too. But when I lost the whip, yeah. And then there was a move then within certain members of the party who thought I was undesirable to get me out of the Senate. Now, I was beaten by 0.6 of a vote. One more transfer, and I'd be back in the Senate. Now, I have an attitude, I suppose something to do with my age, but I accepted that immediately. And the only time that I regretted not being there was during this debate and the abortion debate, particularly this one. I said, oh my God, if I was only there, perhaps I could influence them, because one man can influence a whole party if he knows what he's talking about and if he's sincere in his beliefs.
And William Binchy stood as well, and he would be an asset to the Senate on legal matters, wouldn't he? Would you agree with that, Michael?
And he was beaten for the Senate, which was an awful pity, the university panel.
But I'd like to make a point about, I've listened to a very long thing, which is very interesting. First of all, I can sympathise with Emily about being in the loop and being out of the loop.
You've been in both. You've seen both days,
I
haven't you?
certainly have. But just let me lay one for a second, lay the kind of piece of nonsense that is going around, that somewhere or another this divorce issue might have been just some kind of a Liberal or a Dublin 4 issue. I printed the case for civil divorce in my election literature in 1977, nearly 20 years ago, in a conservative enough constituency, one would say, in Galway West. And it was part of a campaign. But in 1976, a year earlier, in the Senate, the Senate voted 49 votes to 11 to defeat a piece of legislation introduced by then Senator Mary Robinson and John Hogan and myself to remove the status of illegitimacy from children. And I remember one senator saying, this is socialism under the sheets.
Yes. I always voted.
And what happened, of course, but which
yeah.
was 49 votes to 11. We were defeated. 10 years later, the law changed. Now, what is happening is that there is social change taking place. And I really think that we're in grave danger of losing the run of ourselves. To think that there are 50% of those who voted in Ireland who say, above all else, we're staying up tonight to decide where we stand on divorce. I suspect that people cast their vote about the economy, about peace in Northern Ireland, about rights, about issues in social welfare and health and housing. And the idea that you could have, if people want to go to court, people are perfectly free to. If people want to put forward candidates, one did in my constituency the last election, got 1,200 votes. If they all want to stand, let them go through the electorate. But what I profoundly reject is the idea of people who say that those who go to the trouble of publishing their policies like I did 20 years ago, and then, for example, not being elected, or then later being elected as social change moves on, that somehow or another we are disqualified. This is nonsense, and it is interestingly profoundly undemocratic, because it's chipping away all of the time to say that any group of people who believe in just one particular thing, even though that they haven't a large particular following, I would fight for their rights. But the suggestion that they are more important than the elected members of an Oireachtas is absolutely outrageous and little less.
But Michael, I think you misunderstood the point there. You know, dealing with the question I was asked, you see, what I was saying, and obviously didn't say it very well, but I believe if it wasn't in the coalition pact that divorce was to be dealt with by this government.
But it was.
Yes, that's if it wasn't, it wouldn't have been dealt with.
Well, wouldn't that be dreadful?
No.
I mean, you'd be just saying then that a civil right must have a popular majority before the right is accepted.
Let me finish. Michael, let me finish, and I'll let you finish.
I will, of course, Des, and I was really talking about some of the others as well. But here's your problem.
No, he knows.
Why did the illegitimate children have to wait 10 years?
Well, listen, to me that's disgraceful, because all my life
and Rory O'Hanlon didn't catch up as far as
Michael,
two questions.
If you're really being brave about it, all right, or being just about it, what about the issue of the substantive issue of abortion, which is something that your government is continuing to flunk?
We can come back to that. I think that Jay's on.
No, but all my life...
We can be in and out of the loop on that too.
Look, you're talking about the name illegitimate.
Yeah.
Do you know, it comes hard on me, even in this, to use the word illegitimate. Exactly. Because all my life I've hated names put on children.
Yes.
The child is innocent, the child was always innocent, and it's the child that gets the blame. Yeah. You know, I've hated all my positive life.
Right.
I accept that.
Right. Well,
I know you
I
do.
want to bring the audience in on
Rory
this.
O'Hanlon who used
No, the audience is coming in. Stephen Johnson, who asked this question, of a lot of offers in the audience, yes.
Yeah, I feel the politicians have let us down over the past few months in the sense of being servants of the people. Leadership, yes. I don't actually believe what they gave us was leadership, and as a young person I have a lot of concerns about the future if we have similar situations like this, where a very important social and economic issue gets such a one-sided coverage from our politicians.
Right. Woman in the aisle at the back, yes?
I think what's needed now is for a new credible party to be set up by already sitting TDs who feel that their party is no longer representing their views, and I think that's what's needed now for a healthy future.
Right, third row here in the aisle again, yes.
John, thanks for allowing me to speak. First of all, the politicians are elected to represent people. They clearly didn't do that in this referendum. But more importantly, John, let me make this point about the Constitution. The government have been found guilty of acting unconstitutionally. That is a serious matter. But worse still, because of the money involved, there can be no doubt that it swung the 0.5%. That money won the 0.5% that won the election. Yeah. So the government had benefited from acting unconstitutionally. That is a serious matter, because the Constitution is the protection for us all.
Woman behind you there, yes, with her hand up, yeah.
I think 50% of the electorate have been disenfranchised, and they should support parties like Minton O'Heron and break the Liberal consensus in the Dáil.
Right. It's the woman just over here, yes.
Listen, we're speaking about 50% of the electors that have been disenfranchised or whatever. That's what you're speaking about. What about all those people for so long who have been in second relationships, who have not been legalised? I'm sure they felt disenfranchised. And the way you're feeling now, the way they felt.
Okay, woman here in the red, yeah.
Just precisely on that point, I mean, I think it's a bit unfair at this point when people are celebrating, and I agree it is good for people in second units, that small percentage who are going to want that. But it's just that so many people, from talking to separated people who are not in the second union, maybe you're going to call them, they're complaining or something, they are very, very upset about the introduction of divorce. We had a woman we were talking to nearly on tears on the doorstep with her little boy, you know, worrying about divorce and the effects. And I know you'll argue that it's not going to have any effect on her, but she knows she's the first family and she's going to suffer. The another one, just the night before she'd put up her little handmade sign saying vote no because of her own feelings, and they are real people too.
Right. Okay, we're going to leave that there. We have a very long agenda, and Karen Power, I won't bring you in again. Karen Power has another question here.
What is there to learn from the Rosemary West case?
Right, the
Particularly
Rosemary West case, especially in Ireland. Declan Calvert.
Quite a lot of things that George Orwell was wrong when he wrote an essay called The Decline of the English Murder, for a start. I think what is appalling about this case is really the way it's been reported, and as appalling in the so-called serious broadsheets as in the tabloids. For instance, last Thursday, I think it was, in the London Times, there were 4.5 pages about this case, going into the most salacious detail, and the judge involved has accused the newspapers of treating the material more as entertainment rather than information. There are stories about, say, a policewoman involved in the case actually negotiating deals with literary agents. Stories about the Star newspaper buying stories about sex with animals and so forth. So the obvious lesson is that the whole of the print media in Britain in its coverage of this, or at least great parts of it, have been coarsened. And you're having something analogous to the TV treatment of the OJ case in America. Now, obviously, having said that,
aren't we lucky that cameras weren't in this court?
Exactly, and it's another case for keeping them out. But at the same time, one has to admit that people do this. They pay money for this information and for these stories in order to sell newspapers. There is a very, very unpleasant kind of market out there for this kind of thing. Otherwise, the papers wouldn't sell. And I think, really, there's a moral question that editors have to face up as to whether or not they should feed it. And my answer would be no, they should not do this.
Well, there are a number of different issues. First of all, the courts must be in public, and the right of reporting the detail has to be there. It's then for the editor to decide how much of that is necessary. But the right to publish it surely has to be there. You couldn't censor the document
of course,
by law.
But people have gone well beyond those limits. I mean, there are clear cases even of witnesses in the trial admitting during the course of investigation that they were approached by papers to sell their story. Yeah. Now, obviously, such a witness has a vested interest in spicing up the story.
Or in not spicing it up, saving bits of it for the newspaper to make it exclusive. Either way, but distorting it.
But much more likely to spice it up, because if you secure a conviction at the end, perhaps on the basis of exactly that evidence, it's even more saleable. So I think there are all kinds of problems there. And I think we could get moralistic about it because it's happening next door in Britain. But I do think this taste is widespread in people, and it is to be questioned. I mean, forgive me criticising RTE again, but there is a series running on RTE at the moment called Thou Shalt Not Kill.
Do you have difficulties with that?
Well, I don't watch it in general because I find it unpleasant, but I'm amazed at how many decent, gentle folk of my acquaintance tune in regularly every week, and the book based on it is a bestseller. Now, one of the cases covered in that was the relatively recent MacArthur case. People involved in that case are walking around, many of them very vulnerable, and yet the thing is in some way being treated as entertainment. So if we condemn and we should, the treatment of the West case...
Entertainment's a bit unfair, as a documentary, but a very recent killing.
But there's no doubt that there is a clearly entertainment element in it, otherwise it wouldn't be such a best-selling programme, such a best-selling book. And I think all this has to be questioned.
Right. Des Hannafin, what's your view?
Well, I find it difficult, and always did, you know, to look at or talk about the subject, anything to do with children or the type of thing that happened in West. Now, the fact that newspapers should be buying stories, I mean, that's disgusting. But the papers have to, in some form, I mean, they could modify it.
And they are modifying it.
Yes, but
they're censoring it
to.
Heavily as they report it. I mean, the reporters themselves find it difficult to stay in court.
Court, yes. But
a lot of people are not reading it at all.
They needn't print all that is being printed. but they have to alert people that things like this do happen. I mean, it was difficult to think that this could happen in our age. It's difficult to think that the people in the same street, you know, didn't know something was strange, but this is what happens, they don't. So people have to be alerted, children have to be alerted, that there are mad, evil people in existence.
But there's a difference.
And they are evil, they're satanic.
There's a difference between alerting them and hyping it.
Yes.
I mean, Jeremy Paxman wrote a very interesting article the other day about this, when he said when he was a boy, his parents would cut out the murder reports from the paper before they gave it to him. But he said if you had last week's papers and cut out the murder reports, there'd be no paper left. In the Sun newspaper, there were 32 pages about it.
Yeah.
I think that there are several difficult and competing principles. One, I agree entirely with your own observation. I think there's a consensus that no one is arguing for going away from the concept of the open trial. Now that's a fundamental. So you next come on then. I have another view myself, that I often have been looking at a program that was very horrific. And remember now, I had made myself look at tortured bodies and in the third world and places like Salvador and Africa and whatever, things that I would not choose to do. But let me just not talk about that, but draw from that kind of principle and say, if the world did not know of what happened in Dachau and Auschwitz and whatever, you probably wouldn't have as developed a human rights philosophy. That was the great moral push, that we'd fallen to a nadir of human behaviour that perhaps we shouldn't get. Now
That's
you
the
come
best
on,
answer tonight.
now you come on to the next point of it then, which is the interesting point of it, and that is, how then do you handle it? Because you really, I would be against all forms of censorship. So you're back now to a media assessment of its responsibilities in a particular culture, at a particular state of newspaper distribution. What decisions does it make? It would be very hard to conclude that there has been responsibility that looks at, for example, giving the people the substance of the case without imperiling the legal process and abusing your readership, that there was in fact a race for titillating and voyeuristic detail that was to the detriment of the public.
Emily O'Reilly.
Knowing about Dachau didn't stop Bosnia. I mean, it would be wonderful if that had happened. And I think, I think there has to be a consensus on this, but I think individual newspapers did make, and media stations did make, moral judgments and ethical judgments on how to report this. I mean, not everybody treated it in the same salacious way that some of the other newspapers did. But I think there were, one of the good things that did come out of the media coverage of the trial was it showed the gaps in the social services in Britain. I mean, the idea that those children had been in and out of care, in and out of the social services net is just horrific.
Those certain children have come in and out of our social services net and not been found. Yeah. Karen Parr, who asked the question.
I'd have to agree with Emily O'Reilly. She was really getting to the point that I was trying to get to, and I think it's very important that social services, police and the community at large try to liaise more, particularly in relation to children and childcare issues like this. It's
more case conferences where they compare notes and one knows what the other is doing.
Yes, or that it's just encouraged that people will relate information that they have, particularly in relation to children, and that you don't just close your door and forget about it.
Yes. Anybody else on this? Yes.
Well, I think we have to be careful about attributing blame to the media as well.